Okay, so you've seen the GE 2025 headlines, but maybe you're looking for a bit more, right? Trying to understand why things went the way they did, why the PAP got such a strong result.
Exactly. There's always more beneath the surface numbers.
So we've done a deep dive for you. We've pulled together insights from quite a range of places, Reddit threads, expert takes from CNA and the Straits Times, even Forbes weighed in.
And race media, too, plus the Wikipedia election info and a recent YouGov poll. It gives us a pretty wide lens from, gut feelings online to detailed analysis.
Our goal here is really just to unpack it all, to try and find the key drivers behind this election outcome.
Yeah.
What was really moving the needle for voters?
Yeah, let's get into it. Because it's not just about the final tally, but the thinking behind those votes, the anxieties, the priorities.
Right. So first off, the big picture. The
Yeah.
PAP won big.
Yeah.
87 out of 97 seats, pulling in 65.57% of the vote share. That's according to both Straits Times and CNA.
Can't argue with those numbers. It's a clear mandate. And interestingly, analysts are framing this as a flight to safety. That phrase keeps coming up.
Fleet to safety. It sounds like people were maybe nervous about something.
Well, yeah, it suggests voters were prioritizing, let's say, continuity and stability, maybe even over arguments for more opposition checks and balances. That's a significant choice.
Especially considering this was PM Lawrence Wong's first election at the helm. CNA pointed out he actually broke the usual trend where new PMs often see a vote dip.
That's a key point. It suggests real confidence or perhaps reinforces that safety narrative.
Yeah.
The PAP's message about needing experienced hands during uncertain times, warning about losing key ministers, that seems to have hit home.
Safety and security amid, what, global economic worries.
Precisely. That seems to be the underlying feeling captured by the analysts.
And, we saw similar ideas popping up on Reddit, too. Someone called Frashweed basically said, look, most Singaporeans feel they're doing okay, so why rock the boat?
It's a blunt take, maybe, but it taps into that same sentiment, doesn't it?
Yeah. And another user, L Craziness, linked it to the leadership change happening alongside a feeling of maybe a worldwide crisis on the horizon. They felt people might just knuckle down and swing towards PAP again.
Suggesting that, the rhetoric focusing on potential risks, it works. It resonates when people feel uncertain.
And then you have Forbes looking at it from the outside saying, this strong PAP win actually helps cement Singapore's image as a global wealth hub.
Right, because stability is key for that image, isn't it? It sends a signal to international markets and investors that Singapore is predictable, reliable, especially when, other parts of the world feel less stable.
Okay, so that's the incumbent side. But what about the opposition, the Woofers Party, the WP?
Well, the WP held on to their seats, which is something given the overall swing, but they didn't make any new gains. CNA noted they're still the only opposition party actually in parliament.
So a mixed result for them, maybe? Analysts seem divided on whether it's positive or not.
Yeah, holding steady could be seen as a win in itself, contextually. But then you look at the Progress Singapore Party, the PSP.
Yeah. They had a tougher time, didn't they? Their vote share dropped quite a bit in West Coast Jurong, West GRC compared to 2020.
It did, down from about 48% to just under 40%. And crucially, that meant losing their NCMP seats, those non-constituency MP spots.
That's a blow. So what are the analysts saying about the PSP now?
The Straits Times reported suggestions that the PSP needs a bit of a rethink, maybe looking beyond their founder, Tan Cheng Bok, for their identity, and really asking if their policy ideas are connecting with enough voters.
They did have quite a few policies on the table, like reversing the GST hike, a universal minimum wage, things aimed at cost of living and lower earners.
Yes, and land cost exemptions for first-time flat buyers, too. But the feedback reported by Straits Times was that some analysts saw these as perhaps too radical or questioned their fiscal sustainability in the long run.
So a potential mismatch between the proposed solutions and what voters felt was practical or needed right now.
That seems to be the challenge highlighted. It's tough for opposition parties to pitch big changes, especially if the mood is leaning towards caution.
We sent a related idea on Reddit, too, actually. User Bookfripper mentioned voters might be tired of what they called mosquito parties.
Meaning?
Parties that, just seem to pop up around election time without much consistent presence or concrete long-term plans. They use the NSP as an example of a party struggling despite contesting for years.
That points to the need for sustained effort, building trust over time, not just during the campaign buzz. And another Reddit user, Binary Doom, brought up the resource gap. Opposition parties just don't have the same reach or funds.
And they mentioned difficulty connecting with older voters who often lean towards stability, especially, again, in turbulent time.
Right. CNA's analysis even suggested some of the other smaller opposition parties might be trailing further behind now, maybe even facing decline. It's a tough landscape.
Let's pivot slightly and focus more directly on those economic concerns. Rice Media had a piece arguing that money matters, jobs, cost of living, financial worries are usually front and center in Singapore elections.
Yeah, they made a really interesting point. They said the outcome often depends on whether voters blame these anxieties on domestic policies, which might help the opposition.
Or on external factors, like global conditions, which might actually benefit the incumbent, the PAP.
Exactly. And right now, there's certainly plenty of those external conditions to point to. Global tensions, trade issues like the US-China tariffs we've discussed before, things that could genuinely impact Singapore's growth.
So the thinking is people feel that economic pressure, maybe see the global picture, and decide they trust the current government more to navigate it.
That seems to be the core narrative reflected in the results and the analysis, that flight to safety again, prioritizing stability and trust in the PAP to handle these economic uncertainties.
Which might then overshadow other valid concerns, perhaps around inequality or the gig economy, that the opposition might raise.
Potentially, yes. In this specific climate, the desire for a steady hand seems to have outweighed calls for more drastic change or critique, even if those issues exist.
That Reddit comment about a worldwide crisis really does seem to capture that underlying economic anxiety driving choices.
It does. It frames the vote as a response to perceived external threats, leaning towards perceived security.
Okay, what about younger voters? There's often talk about them wanting more change.
Right. Rice Media looked at this back in 2020, finding younger voters did want more diverse voices, more debate. But the recent YouGov survey from April this year adds a bit more nuance.
What did that find?
It suggested that while Gen Z, for example, might be more open to changing their minds late in the game, a lot of voters across all age groups, including the younger ones, had actually decided how they'd vote quite early on.
So the desire for diversity might still be there, but maybe it wasn't the deciding factor this time around. The stability argument might have resonated strongly even with younger demographics in GE 2025. Possibly. We even had one Reddit user, Dreamy Lucid, speculating, and this is just speculation, that maybe Gen Z's financial literacy made them wary of opposition policies they saw as fiscally unsound.
That's an interesting thought. It suggests even younger voters might be weighing economic management quite heavily, especially when the outlook feels uncertain. It's not just about wanting different voices, perhaps.
Yeah, maybe it's about wanting different voices and feeling confident about the economic plan.
Which brings us to that perennial debate, checks and balances versus effective governance. Saw an interesting Reddit discussion on this.
Oh, yeah.
User Budget Watergate argued strongly that checks and balances aren't about creating chaos. They're actually vital for good, sustainable government in the long term. You can't just rely on, getting lucky with great leaders forever.
Makes sense. What was the counter argument?
Essentially, why fix what isn't broken? Or perhaps more accurately, why introduce elements that might create friction or instability when the current system seems to be delivering results, especially during uncertain times?
And looking at the election outcome.
It does suggest that for a significant number of voters this time, the perceived effectiveness and stability of the current setup outweighed the desire for stronger opposition checks. The don't rock the boat argument seems to have won out.
So wrapping this deep dive up, it really looks like GE 2025 boiled down to a strong vote for stability, for trust in the PAP, likely driven by those global economic jitters we talked about.
Yeah, that feeling seems to have eclipsed the push for more opposition voices, more debate, at least for now. And for the opposition, especially parties like the PSP, there are clear challenges ahead: branding, policy appeal, staying engaged between elections.
We hope pulling together these different perspectives from analysts, commentators, Redditors, polls, gives you a clearer picture of the forces shaping this result.
Absolutely. And it leaves us with a question for you to think about. Looking ahead, with the global situation still pretty uncertain, how do you see that balance shifting? The balance between wanting stability and wanting more diverse political voices.
And how big a role will economic worries continue to play in shaping voter choices in Singapore? Something to mull over. We definitely encourage you to check out the sources yourself and keep thinking critically.